Okay, so the title of this panel is Sustaining the Press Function, and we are going to focus on wider possibilities for ways in which law and policy could more affirmatively sustain the democracy-enhancing press functions. So not maybe utopian, but just thinking about ways in which we can address a lot of the issues that we've been talking about earlier. So first of all, I'm going to give brief introductions of our panelists. As others have said, there's more information on them in the program, but immediately to my left is Courtney Radsch. See, I practice this. Courtney Radsch, who holds a PhD in international relations and has been a journalist in the Middle East and the United States. She's currently the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute. In this role, Courtney, produces and oversees cutting-edge research into news media market structures and helps design smart policy solutions to protect and bolster journalism's financial and editorial independence. To Courtney's left is Victor Pickard, who is the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, where he co-directs the Media Inequality and Change Center. Previously, he taught at NYU and the University of Virginia. Victor writes widely on issues related to journalism, media, and democracy. Then we have Wes Lowery, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and one of the nation's leading reporters on issues of race and justice. He's the executive director of the Investigative Reporting Workshop, an innovative training hospital journalism nonprofit based at American University in Washington, D.C. He's also a journalist in residence at the CUNY Newmark Graduate School of Journalism and a contributing editor at the Marshall Project. And finally, at the end, we have Heidi Kitrosser, who is a William W. Gurley Professor of Law at Northwestern University. She's an expert on the constitutional law of federal government's secrecy and on separation of powers and free speech law more broadly. Heidi is also on the steering committee of the Free Expression Legal Network, a new initiative spearheaded by Yale's Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic and the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. So thank you all for joining me. I think we can all agree that based on our panel and everyone who's talked here today so far, including Martha Minow, who has elaborated on this in her book, there's a broad consensus that due to the broad decimation of traditional news outlets, particularly at the local level, that have been brought about by the forces of the internet and big tech, the traditional commercial news system is currently unsustainable in terms of furthering the kinds of press functions and democracy-enhancing functions that we've been discussing here. Indeed, there are reasons to question whether the traditional commercial news system has ever, or at least consistently, functioned well in terms of furthering democracy and guaranteeing meaningful access to news and information for everyone. So the focus of this panel is on the promises and possible pitfalls of alternative ways to support a free and independent press, including through direct government funding. So I'd like to begin the discussion by exploring some of the kinds of alternative models that might best support a free and independent press. Wes, in the paper that you've written for the symposium, and you have, of course, worked in a nonprofit news model, you've written about that nonprofit news model as an alternative to traditional commercial news outlets. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the effectiveness and viability of nonprofit news media in terms of furthering democratic values.
Sure. Happy to do that. I think that when we look at the nonprofit model currently, I think there is obviously a lot of promise, while I was certainly a significant limitation. So when you look at nonprofit news, one, there's always been some component of it in our media ecosystem. We think very often of NPR and PBS. We think of it as public media. Although I would complicate it a little bit, because when we look at how much revenue actually comes from the government itself versus viewers and listeners like you. That is, in fact, that gives away the game about the fact that this is, in fact, a nonprofit news organization that receives some federal grant funding, right? But we've seen a remarkable rise in the number and amount of nonprofit news organizations as we've seen the contraction of for-profit news, especially locally, and as journalists have tried to find new ways and new models. In 2005, there were 2015, there were about 140 nonprofit news organizations. Today, there are 400 of them. And so we've seen a massive response and growth. Almost all that growth is in local markets. But that said, there's still the amount of philanthropic foundation and viewers and listeners like you funding is still far beneath anywhere close what would be required to actually fill the space left behind by commercial press. So the relatively conservative studies by whether it be Boston Consulting Group and others estimate that we need at least $2, $3, $4 billion worth of nonprofit giving to replace what was lost in commercial media. Right now, we're looking at something like $150 million. Even if the noble attempts by organizations like MacArthur and Knight with Press Forward succeed, that would go up to being $250 million. And so, nowhere close to what we need to sustain our media. And so I think that part of what we have to think about, what we have to grapple with, is that if there is true market failure, which people with expertise far beyond my own, including some on this panel, have said, right, and have concluded, then we have to grapple with solutions that do not themselves rely on the market. Charitable giving is an extension of the market. We are taking people who have extracted capital via the open market and who are receiving tax breaks for giving the money back away. That can be a component of how we provide for public goods and public services. But I do think that it's becoming increasingly clear, desperately quickly, that nonprofit media is just a tax status, and that it is something that cannot and will not actually sustain the media ecosystem we need, at least not the one that we need to have a healthy public opinion and therefore a healthy public democracy.
Thanks. That's been very helpful. And I'd like to then also talk about non-market-based solutions. But first, I wanted to talk with Courtney because I know that you have written about regulatory efforts around the world that attempt to shore up the financial stability and structural independence of the news media, particularly as a response to the impact of big tech companies' financial model on the ability of the news media to continue to function. So I was wondering if you could talk about the types of regulatory interventions that you think have been or that might have promised to be successful in terms of supporting a functioning press, and these models could come from here or abroad.
Yeah, thank you. So is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So I think one of the challenges, and you kind of alluded to this, Wes, is, nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. We still need a functioning market for nonprofit news to work or for commercial news. And so there are market failures, but I think that instead of throwing our hands up and being like, all right, well, let's depend on the billionaires, we need to fix the market failures. And so what we're seeing around the world right now is this effort to rebalance an incredibly imbalanced information ecosystem. And I think it's really helpful to think about an information ecosystem. So we're not just thinking about the press and what we need to do to support the press, because it exists in a wider market where public policies shape the ability of the press to fulfill its public interest mission. So news media bargaining codes, which is kind of shorthand for what you've seen happen in Australia, Canada, proposals here with the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act and state laws, including in California, and actually a dozen countries around the world and jurisdictions that are exploring these would do a little thing to try to rebalance that playing field. And that would essentially mandate certain types of tech companies. Right now, it's focused on social and search companies of a certain size to negotiate for the value that is provided by news publishers when they repost picture, high quality images, links, and the, little snippets. So you don't even need to click through. And so we're seeing this effort to and then to allow small media to collectively bargain. So I did a survey a couple of years ago where I interviewed about 300 journalists around the world working in countries where they receive development assistance, and they're held hostage by how the U.S. And the global North govern these technology companies. It really affects their ability. So we have to look at this beyond just the U.S. So the local news deserts situation is something we're seeing around the world. So the news media bargaining codes are promising because now with AI coming in and essentially saying we're going to develop the next generation of incredibly valuable companies through the theft of your intellectual property, these news media bargaining codes could provide a place to negotiate for that value. We're also seeing things like tax breaks for hiring journalists, which gets to headcount in the newsroom. There's a lot of concern about, are these policies going to only benefit the big guys, or are they going to, benefit the small ones? And I think you need both. We live in an ecosystem. We know that lots of local news stories percolate up into the regional, the national, the international news. We also see tax breaks for subscriptions. Unfortunately, there was a study that just came out in February in Philadelphia. They gave subsidized, free subscriptions, and nobody wanted them. So there's also the demand side problem. But I do think that, the big elephant in the room is market failure. So instead of giving up on that and saying well, let's depend on a bunch of wealthy people or put everything behind a paywall so information becomes a luxury good, that's a very dangerous way to move for our democracy, for democratic values.
Thank you. So I want to go back to Wes, because you had mentioned sort of that nonprofit news organizations do provide a certain amount of sustainability or through philanthropic and membership drives to news outlets that are not bound to the bottom line in the ways that commercial news outlets are. And then you were talking about the sort of scale of money that would need to actually truly prop up and support a vibrant, independent press. And so you have actually, in your paper that you wrote, you called for something, I thought this was very interesting, for a federal public trust, which to ensure that every American has access to the news and the information that they need to be full citizens in our democracy. So could you describe what this program would look like?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. And I'll rewind for a little bit. So as you noted, right, I do think that the nonprofit model has a space in this conversation. But that said, there are still capitalist incentives and capitalist pressures, right? The first is that what we know is that there are many communities that do not have a foundation, philanthropic support, or the wealth in the community to support a nonprofit news organization. So if you live in a place where everyone has the money to give away to a nonprofit news organization, then that works. However, if we want to limit it on to where everyone has access to news and information, communities that most need that news and information are not going to be able to support this vital service. Beyond that, it is not as if, while they may not be beholden to billionaire owners or to subscribers, they are beholden to their foundation and other benefactors, right? And so we see this very often in philanthropic spaces where something is the focus for a moment and a lot of philanthropy gets around it, and then another shiny object shows up. And so what we see in terms of, in fact, in most nonprofit news spaces, the key term being used by philanthropic donors is sustainability. Is you better figure this out by the time our money runs out, because we're not paying for this to keep existing. Is the longer version of what sustainability means, right? It means that we are not committed to your long-term existence. Figure out a way to support yourself. The problem is if there was a market solution to support local news, the capitalists would have figured it out sometime in the last 100 years. Leaving it to a bunch of nonprofits is not going to outfit that either. What I do think, or one of the things I think we have to think about, and there's been conversation around the idea of civic information or public information, right? That what does it mean and what does it look like for us to think about embedded in the First Amendment? They're not just being a negative restriction on the government, but they're being the proactive, positive right held by the individual. What does it mean for us to have a right to know, a right to information? Then if our democracy is built on the public opinion, right, what is equality or full citizenship if not being able and empowered and equipped to fully participate in that democracy, which you cannot do without ready access to quality information about the world in which we live. Now, if that is a right, well, we in fact have developed a thinking around what we do when something is supposedly guaranteed constitutionally and yet the market will not support it. We build government systems to ensure some amount of equality and equity there. And so part of what I talked about in the paper we're working on is in the question of what would it look like to build something like the way the NSF is set up, or where we say each congressional district receives a certain amount of federal money each year in news and information grants, right? Money that goes into communities that is available to civic institutions, corporate media, nonprofit media, the library, your church, right? To provide for a minimum viable standard of news and information here. We know that so much of the information that is most vital to a community, government documents how to register your car and enroll in schools in the language of the refugee community who has just showed up, how to register to vote, who is running, and what those ballot initiatives really mean, where to get a COVID shot. All of those things are actual vital pieces of information that you cannot sell at the market in a way that is going to bring you profits, right? And so what does it mean and what might it look like for us to collectively incentivize the news and information that we actually need, but that itself is not self-sustainable with market solutions? And I think that we have to look in that space. A lot of the policy solutions that have been pursued recently, which I think are really smart, make a real point of stopping short of direct government funding for news. We will give money to the capitalists to hire more journalists, right? We will give a tax break to the corporation if they don't lay someone. Well, I support all those things, right? But that falls far short of us actually ensuring news and information to people. And again, if we actually believe there is a market failure, we have an obligation to do that.
And just to clarify, when you said NSF, that's not National Science.
The National Science Foundation, right? So,
Yeah.
so the feds give out what, $8-9 billion a year to that props up most of the scientific research done by colleges and universities in the country. And so again, giving $10 million a year to every congressional district in the country would cost $4.6 billion, so half of that. What would that do to news and information in Montana or Alaska or Harlem or any community around the country if suddenly the libraries, the local papers, civic institutions had access to grant funding that might help them provide the types of information we need that their local paper either can't afford to provide or would never be economically incentivized to provide because they can't actually make money off of it.
Okay. Sounds great to me. We're going to have to just assume that Congress will definitely pass this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's
This legislative session.
well. If you like it, we're good.
Yeah.
It's not. It's just.
Yes, I'm the bellwether. So I wanted to turn to Victor because you have also called for something that you phrase as non-reformist media reforms. And in the piece that you submitted for this symposium, you've argued that a positive rights-based view of press rights can be located in our history and in numerous sources, maybe not in sort of mainstream First Amendment doctrine, which generally has focused on freedom from government interference. But you argue that there is a way to find, both from our history and certain key legal cases, the basis for a right for the government to guarantee a right to freedom, information and news. So I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by non-reformist media reforms, and then talk a little bit about that history and these sources of that you think support a positive rights-based right to free press.
Sure, thank you. There's a bit there to unpack, but I'll start out. Saying non-reformist media reforms, which doesn't quite roll off your tongue, so we should probably come up with a different term. But I will end there. I want to back up just for a moment and build on some of the things that Wes was just talking about, which is, I think what we're confronting here is not just the textbook case of market failure, but I refer to it as systemic market failure. There is no market-based correction to these structural problems. So I do think we need to start imagining these very long-term, ambitious projects, think like Marshall Plan style rebuilding, because we're not just talking about protecting what little journalism still remains today, but we really have to rebuild in all the news deserts and try to serve all the communities, many of whom have never been well served by a commercial media system. So if we're thinking ambitiously and we recognize that this is going to take many years to get there, we have to at least have this radical vision on our political horizon. And that's where I think the positive rights really needs to become part of the discursive landscape. We have our Constitution, which some scholars have referred to as a constitutional exceptionalism, has been very focused on protecting negative rights. And we have to start imagining what our government should be doing to intervene on our behalf to make sure that we have access to an actual viable press system. The First Amendment presupposes the existence of a press system. So we have to begin imagining what government should be doing to ensure that there is a press actually to protect going well into the future. And so there it requires this project of really denaturalizing many of our assumptions about the First Amendment. We have a kind of libertarian impulse that is so fixated on negative rights are very important. We want to protect those, but we can look historically, internationally, for different articulations that are more based on positive rights, whether we're talking about Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or if we're looking at the German Constitution, which mandates and sanctifies a public broadcasting system. So there are many places we can look. We also could be looking to our state constitutions to begin seeing more positive articulations around press freedoms there. So that's part of this broader, more ambitious project.
Could you give an example of specifically about state constitutions, of any guarantees in state constitutions that would provide a broader right of access or broader right of a right to information?
Sure. So this, admittedly, is a new area of research for me, and people have been handing me. Just actually yesterday, Christina sent me a spreadsheet showing all the different, in all 50 states, the positive articulations. And there's one in Kentucky that guarantees a free, like having your own press if you're reporting on the state government. So there are some really wild positive rights-based articulations of where, we can start imagining that we really do have a right to the press. Now, I don't know if this is actually going to hold up in the courts, in the federal courts, but it's at least at the discursive level, I think this is where we need to begin.
It's always, I feel like people often, or at least in my life as a lawyer, we've bounced between the federal and the state constitutions about whether they're better, more rights protective or not, and going back and forth. So it's the continuing laboratory of democracy, I guess. So we've now had some discussion about, okay, we need a non-market-based solution, which most people talk about as direct government funding in one way or another. Well, it could be tax subsidies in other ways, but one is direct government funding for the media, either based on, our one example of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or people talk about BBC, or whatever whatever model we want to take. I wanted to start talking with Heidi because in your piece, you focus on, which I think is really interesting. So the idea is if you can have, and one of our audience members asked earlier after the first panel, direct government's funding would be terrible for the media, because if you are funded by the government, you're going to be constrained in what you have to say, and then the press wouldn't be able to provide, serve or engage in the function of pushing back and challenging the government. And so some people talk about this as either state capture, it could be fully state capture, basically state-run government, or it could just be in more subtle ways or, in medium ways. So Heidi, you talked about, would there be a way through, I think, legal and constitutional analysis to, if there was direct government funding of the media, to argue that there is a bulwark against, through a legal framework of having the government control the message. And you talk in particular about an anti-distortion principle that can be found in existing First Amendment precedent cases that the Supreme Court has decided, and that principle might provide a legal mechanism to protect against state capture. So could you talk a little bit about how you define the anti-distortion principle and how is it reflected in existing precedent?
Yeah, absolutely. Is the mic on? Okay, great. Thanks so much. So exactly as you set it up, you set it up in a way that the question in a way that, very much mirrors sort of my motivation and my thinking in writing this paper and working on the anti-distortion principle, which is that I am perhaps motivated, as much as I am motivated by a fear of capture of government-funded entities, perhaps even more so, I'm motivated by my agreement with everyone on the panel and by much of what we heard earlier today, that we desperately do need non-market funding sources. And I think we do need government assistance. And as several people very eloquently put it, I think we need that not just as a practical matter and legislation providing as such, but I think ideally we need to persuade members of the public as well as politicians of why this is so very important. This is not a luxury good, for some, or rent-seeking, for some small group that's going to benefit. This really gets to a right that every American has, at least if we want to live in a functioning democracy. So I do think government presence is essential. But then there's exactly the potential capture problem, which, as you said, a gentleman this morning sitting right in front of me, made an excellent point in asking about that. And so we need to address it because it's a real risk. I also think we need to address it because it's an argument that in addition to being grounded in a real risk, some groups can sort of harness it in bad faith as well. I think individuals who just don't like the press and don't like government scrutiny and don't want to see government funding also bring up the capture. So we have to address it, right? And so as Katie mentioned in the paper for this symposium, I suggest that we can get some inspiration in existing First Amendment case law for a way to ensure that funding comes with some guarantees, or at least that funding recipients have legal arguments available to them if there are attempts at capture that could protect against such capture. And the basic idea, I guess, to put it in simplest terms, to go to what I mean by anti-distortion, right? The basic idea would be to say that when government funds a journalistic entity, when it purports to be funding journalism or the press, that it is essentially tying itself to the mast of the sort of social meaning of what is meant by journalism, what is meant by press, right? So if government says, well, we're funding, investigative journalism because it's very important for our constituents to know what's going on in the community, and then they put strings on that to the effect of, this is an oversimplified example, although it once shocked me to actually see it in legislation or an executive directive. But if they then say, for example, but you can't criticize the governor, or if, back channel communications are offered to that effect, or if structurally they say, we're going to set this up in such a way that the stories go through the governor's office or go through the press office of this or that political institution, that there might actually be constitutional limits on the ability to do that. The theory being that this actually runs counter to it's antithetical to the very entity that government claims that it's funding when it says it's funding a journalistic entity. And then real briefly, where can we find, we actually can find some support for this in existing case law. I talk in the paper about a number of cases in which the Supreme Court has articulated something akin to an anti-distortion principle. So one of my favorite examples actually comes not from journalism, but from a program of funding for legal services, a case called Legal Services versus Velasquez from 2000, where Congress passed a law that provided for continued funding of the Legal Services Corporation, attorneys for people who can't afford their own attorneys. But they put in a condition on the funding. They said, but by the way, if you're acting pursuant to this funding as an attorney, and let's say you're seeking to help someone who claims that they are illegally at risk of losing their benefits. You can make argument. You have lots of arguments you could make. For example, you could argue that whoever administers the program for them has administered it incorrectly. But there are certain arguments you can't make. You can't argue, for example, that the statute that is being administered is unconstitutional. And the court struck that down because they basically said you're saying two incompatible things. You're saying we're funding lawyering, and then you're saying, but if you want to accept the funds to be a lawyer, you have to impose limits on your zealous advocacy, even though zealous advocacy is the very heart of lawyering, the court argued. So that's, I think, the clearest example from the Supreme Court. There's a fantastic example from a district court of a case very much involving journalism from just a few years ago called Turner versus U.S. Agency for Government Media, in which a district court in D.C. found that the Trump administration had similarly acted in a way that distorted funded journalism when they sought to interfere with Voice of America programming by having political appointees breach the so-called firewall between the political appointees and the people who make the editorial decisions. And again, although the court didn't, actually name it the anti-distortion principle, it was pretty similar reasoning to the effect that this is incompatible with the way newsrooms work and the way they need to work to do the things that the statute that funded them says that they're going to do. Finally, real quick, obviously this raises all kinds of questions about how do you determine what is the nature of an institution so that you can determine if a condition is antithetical to it. I leave that to others. No, I'm kidding. I suggest in the paper that, first of all, we can draw from examples in the case law as to how to do this. I'll just say here, and I'm happy to elaborate if we want to get into it further, that I think there are sort of descriptive factors that one can look to. So, for example, in the Turner case, among the evidence that the court found in the record that the court found interesting and relevant and important was testimony by a Voice of America employee who had spent 20 years at other journalistic institutions explaining how, best practices in journalism include sort of a firewall between the commercial interests and the sort of reporting activity and sort of between the overall evaluation of superiors versus sort of interference in day-to-day newsroom performance. And so the court used that, for example, to say, well, this is sort of considered a best practice in journalism, so you can't purport to fund journalism and then force something that's completely antithetical to that practice that allows political interference in day-to-day reporting. I also think there can be a normative component. Many people this morning spoke, I think, in really insightful ways about some of the key constitutional functions performed by journalism, particularly the checking function of journalists in checking government. So I think normative sort of aspects of the role that journalism plays in furthering constitutional democracy can also be looked to in terms of whether conditions on journalism are antithetical to the thing that a legislature purports to be funding.
That's great. I think that's really interesting. I was very interested in that Voice of America case too, because that does seem like a prime example of it could be just ripe for government control, and how do you protect against that? And I think it was also interesting what you said in your paper about the parallels between this kind of the anti-distortion principle as applied to lawyering or journalism or academic freedom, because in, with public universities, you also have that issue of when the government is funding and employees, but they're engaged in journalism, or teaching or research, what is the extent of the government control? I think I'm trying to do at the time whether anyone you want. Oh yeah,
I think that the examples here emphasize how difficult it is for government to fund press. You have to decide who is going to be a beneficiary, who decides what that definition is. I think one of the things we have in journalism that is helpful is we have a lot of self-regulatory entities. And so, I think I would be much more comfortable. So in Indonesia, for example, they're looking at it. They have a presidential decree, which is not ideal, but, they're looking to a press council to identify, who is a journalist. And I think we heard earlier today about how, we have, for example, the Senate press office, the White House press corps. We have the Society for Professional Journalists. We have donors that give to news organizations. So I think it'd be very interesting to look at how could you look at non-governmental bodies within the profession or the general sense of journalism to make that designation to try to avoid some of that. Here in New York, for example, and elsewhere in the world, there are requirements to use state advertising budgets to make sure that some of that goes to local media. But Anya Schifrin, who teaches at Columbia in SIPA, she holds a saving journalism conference every year. And we've heard about how the, New York advertising is influencing, how the apportion advertising is getting apportioned based on political favors to some extent. And so I think we cannot just give up on the market. We really do have to fix the market because you have some of the earliest Black-owned newspapers were market-based, and the market may have failed to serve everyone, but we do know that you have had many, the ethnic press, different language presses, able to, when there was a functioning market, to serve those populations. We might not have had national press doing that as well, but I think we have to be very careful about just throwing our hands up and being like, oh, well, the market failed, because we don't have unlimited philanthropy. We don't have unlimited state funding. So at some point, you have to figure out how do we correct for the market, especially as we get into the era of AI. Because we heard earlier about someone's family member doing an AI company, to get all the information from city meetings. There's a newspaper that is AI generated that just goes around and steals all the content from real newspapers to create an AI generated newspaper. So as we think about, well, the government's going to fund this, it's going to be very easy to spin up a news outlet. So how are we going to decide, who gets to use AI? If you're just an AI generated, newsroom, are you also getting subsidized? Are we going to end up subsidizing the tech companies that are already, kind of at the forefront and making a lot of money? So I think I don't think we should give up on correcting the market failures.
Heidi?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think those are really important considerations. And it brought to mind something Martha had said earlier when she referred to sort of the need for, I forgot exactly how she put it, but she said, kind of multiple competing forces, or not even necessarily competing, just multiple voices, multiple forces. It made me think of, I think it was John Kenneth Galbraith who sort of coined the term, countervailing powers or countervailing forces. And I think about that all the time. And I think we need that in, the media itself is a countervailing force, I think most importantly against government and also other powerful entities, huge corporations, et cetera, as a countervailing force to them. But we also need sort of multiple countervailing forces within media, partly to check one another, as again, I think someone else had said earlier, And partly also because, as Courtney said, you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, government, yes, I think, as I said, the anti-distortion principle can be helpful, but it's not going to be, 100% effective. There is going to be some government capture, plus there aren't unlimited government funds. So yeah, we need it all, really.
So I think some of this discussion rolls naturally into one of the questions that we have through the QR code, which is, and I apologize if this is a typo or not, but anyway, here's the question. Wes has said that the press should practice moral bin clarity. Is that, I don't know what bin.
I think it's a reference to moral clarity. I think it.
Okay, anyway, sorry, some more moral clarity, let's just call it that. Why should the public, whether by tax breaks or subsidies, bankroll press outlets that consistently and unabashedly have a different moral outlook from half the country?
Well, there are a few assumptions and misframings of things I've said in the question, but in good faith, I think there are a few things. I think the first is that the public, if we go back to Madison and we go back to our understand, and much less through Lippmann and Dewey and our understanding of the First Amendment, right? We can't have a functioning or healthy democracy without a healthy public opinion and without access to quality news and information. I don't know of anyone who currently believes we have a healthy democracy, or of anyone who currently believes we have a healthy public discourse or a healthy set of public news and information. I would note that's an argument against our current market-based press, which brought us to where we are right now, right? If the best judge of the press and our own self-regulatory abilities is our outcomes, we should look around at our democracy and see how well we've done. It's very poor. But once again, if in what I talked about was a world in which local communities received access to funds to provide themselves with the news and information they believe they needed. So I understand that the newspaper publisher in Casper, Wyoming is likely going to have some different ideas and different priorities than the newspaper publisher in the Lower East Side or in Teaneck, New Jersey, or in Shaker Heights, Ohio. But that's actually the beauty of our mass representative democracy, right? That there's no argument for a nationalized government-funded press. The reality is it's an understanding that, again, as Dewey argued, that our job is to create communication in community and to provide each other and ourselves with the information that we need. And that our market is not providing that and will not provide that. That I agree completely that we need countervailing forces. Our news and information ecosystem is currently 99.7% market-based. So how about we build those countervailing forces? Spend billions of dollars on public investment, right? And so right now we're all one thing. There's nothing in the other direction. And this is the outcome we have, a democracy that is failing.
But that is, I would say, in the last, definitely the last decade, if not the last 20 years, because the market is intermediated by massive concentration of power that not only affects the press, but also think about the local advertisers the local businesses who used to advertise in the press are either closing down or they're having to go on Amazon and advertise there. So that's why if we fix the market, we actually can have ripple effects that will lead to a more sustainable press. Because yes, technically we have a, largely private commercial press, but in a very, very distorted market that is platformatized by companies that are unaccountable and enjoy unprecedented and unparalleled legal benefits. Unlike any other, the press does not have the same amount of benefits that, for example, social media, search, AI companies have.
Well, some of them do. Fox News does. That's the press. Breitbart does. Among the massive companies and corporations operating without any market regulation are the press. And that has helped get us to where we are.
So
I don't think anyone's arguing against policy, but building off of our colleague, if the conversation is about creating countervailing forces, We have to actually create those countervailing forces, and we cannot do that only by focusing on market corrections. You have to have an actual real conversation about something beyond the market. I'm all for policy interventions, right? But that alone will not fix it. And because I don't know, because again, that is also based on the premise that there's something we want to get back, that I would also challenge the premise that the market in and of itself will ever be incentivized to give us the news and information that we need to have a functioning democracy.
I agree with you, but the philanthropy and the tax breaks to, fund the journalism, it's going to be ineffective if you don't also correct for the market. So I think
but to be clear, that's all market solutions. Philanthropy is a market solution. Tax breaks are a market solution. They're going to be an effective period because the market cannot provide us the news and information we need to have a healthy, functioning, multiracial, multicultural democracy.
Although, Wes, you also have, I thought if I read correctly in your piece, you were saying that you think you envisioned it at least with did you say two legs, where one was kind of a nonprofit model and the existing, I wasn't exactly sure.
I have to remember how many legs I ended up in. I was editing myself, and
I was like,
I'm still editing myself,
stool?
right?
Okay, yeah.
But it's a multi-leg stool. Again, no one's arguing for a government take over the press, right? But we have, right now we have a stool with exactly one leg, the market. And then we're pretending like philanthropy and nonprofit is a separate leg, even though it's the same leg. And we're pretending as if tax breaks are a separate leg, even though it's the same leg. Giving a tax break to corporations is not separate from the market. It is the market, right? Having people who have extracted billions of dollars in wealth out of the market give charity back so they can get tax breaks, aka philanthropy, is not the market. It's the market. Something's either market or it's public.
Well,
right?
yeah.
That's how it works. We can't pretend that's not how it works.
Just going, 1 second. I just wanted to follow a little bit up on that original question because I do think
there's a QR.
Oh, no, yeah, I will. We do still have time for a question. So if you give me a second. But one of the things in the original question was, what about bankrolling sort of outlets that don't reflect the opinion of half the country? And I do think that goes to the issue of kind of like the Voice of America case. Like, are we talking about a direct government funding to existing news outlets, or are we talking about a more sort of civic-minded National Science Foundation where you're setting up more with hopefully a protection against state capture, where you're setting up more local or to be run by the local communities? And it did kind of remind me, I don't know if it's too far afield in terms of the analogy, but Victor, in your piece, you were talking about the role of the Postal Service, particularly in the 19th century, as seen as this public good that was deserving of funding, where everyone had access to it. And in your mind, is that something that you think could be a potential model?
Well, I think it's definitely a good, I'm not sure if this is on or not. It's definitely a good starting point to just, again, broaden our imagination about what we could do in the future and indeed what we've done in the past. And in today's money, the postal subsidies of the 1800s would be worth tens of billions of dollars. And it was based on a recognition that the market alone would not disseminate news and information efficiently or, to far-flung communities across the country. So that would be a good reminder that media subsidies are as American as apple pie, and that it also is content neutral. I mean, there are some famous violations of that, but in principle, it was content neutral, and it shows a way that government can help support the media that we need as a democracy, but not influence that content. And so I think many of the fears, the sort of knee-jerk reactions that as soon as you have public investments in media, we're going to slide into some sort of totalitarian state. We can look historically and internationally that there's tons of evidence for the contrary. So just again, sort of discursively, I think postal subsidies are a good starting point.
It's also, oh wait, sorry. I know, I just wanted to give this gentleman a chance to ask his question. I don't know. Yes.
I have to. The first half of the conversation was very good. Wesley started off with. Now you went into Disneyland. You're really in Disneyland now. We're talking about the National Public Radio, who just dismissed one of their people who spoke up freely in a column newspaper. You're talking about the public broadcasting system that is controlled by the government. And look at the programming. It is all government funded. It's all government oriented. You have everything, even the corporations that support PBS. They're also government funded. So you've got to have a system where we have independent media, independent press, and you can't have that through government funding. I don't know. I had a not-for-profit. Believe me, filing for charities, just filing to the government. They want to know all your business, who all your funders are, and all that other nonsense. That's not the role of the media. The media has got to be independent of government. And you cannot have it both ways. You can have half your hand in the till and half the hand say, well, we don't know what that hand is doing. No government funding for media, no government funding at all for the press.
So you'll take money from Bloomberg Philanthropies, but not from Mayor Michael Bloomberg. You'll take money from Bezos and Amazon. You'll take money from I mean the nonprofit media.
Oh.
I mean so we're building a nonprofit media, right? So it's okay to have Pulitzer and Hearst and the oil barons own the press, the richest man in the history of humanity owning one of the most important news organizations in the world, and we're not worried about capture. We're not worried about the lack of independence there. We're not worried about well, I'm asking, right, like, that independence is not just about independence from government, right? And in the United States context, our market is just as powerful of a force often as our government is. Yet we have constructed a media ecosystem in which we are completely reliant on one. And we lose our minds if the government wants to give someone $5 to tell people where to register to vote, as if that is going to usher in the end of days. We're already at the end of days. I don't know. I mean, guys, I don't know if we're looking around, but things aren't very good for those of us who care about multiracial democracy, equality, equity, individual human rights. And so the idea that a newspaper publisher in Montana might be able to receive a $10,000 grant from a federal government agency that's independently operated, the same way a researcher at the University of Montana might, is somehow going to threaten the independence of our press more so than the need for them right now to call the richest person in Montana and beg them to buy the newspaper so it exists. Much or the threat that newspaper just closes and doesn't exist at all. I think we have to be willing to engage in the idea of there being countervailing forces, that we need a mosaic model of our press where not everyone is going to do everything. It might very well be true that individual journalists or individual organizations that receive some amount of government money therefore feel less inclined to do some things, but no one is calling for the elimination of the commercial press, which could still do that. No.
Can I? I just want to bring in also the international.
Sir.
Sorry, we're going to just... So I think, it's also helpful to look at the international dimension. And I agree with you. I mean, it is World Press Freedom Day. One of the pillars of press freedom is pluralism. And so we need that in the funding sources, et cetera. But the Nordic countries are very good examples of where you have some government support and the way you structure it matters a lot. So there is a difference between, Voice of America, which is... legally there's supposed to be some editorial separation, but because of the funding, it's more challenging versus the way the BBC is funded, which is through a trust. And so you can structure government funding in ways that creates more distance from political influence, et cetera. And so, the Nordic system is often held up like that. I think one thing that's very interesting with the news media bargaining codes, because I absolutely agree with you. You do not want to be beholden to the wealthiest companies or the wealthiest billionaires in the world. So you need a pluralism of funding. You want to be able to critique all of that. But one of the interesting things in Australia and in Canada is that they said, as we look at to improve the market, we're going to include public broadcasters in that. So they're actually going to get back some of the funding or some of the revenue, and the way that you take in revenue from, say, taxes, whether it's on digital advertising or on, display ads or France taxes, ISPs, and give some of that money back to the media. So there's lots of different ways you could either impose a tax or bring in revenue and then have many layers until you distribute it. California, for example, goes through the University of Berkeley to distribute some of its grants.
Just to follow up real quickly on what Courtney just said, I absolutely agree that, structure to try to separate out sort of any government aid from political interference is so crucial. We talked about that a little bit in terms of how the U.S. Agency for Global Media was structured and the breaching of the firewall and what a problem that was. But also, as you said, Courtney, it can make a big difference exactly how where the bundle of money comes from and, how much discretion there is in doling it out. It called to mind, I read somewhere, it might have actually been Martha's book or possibly Victor's book, or probably someone in this room wrote it somewhere, that the great Newt Minow, who among, of course, his many achievements is he was Martha's dad, that I believe he sort of in, the early days of television in the 50s or 60s, I believe it was he who had this vision that something along the lines of public broadcasting would be funded through taxes on television sets back in the day when you actually went to your local store and bought a television set. But instead, it's a model where, the broadcasters have to go to Congress and beg them for funding. There's a viral video which is very touching, but in a way bespeaks of a political failure that many of you might have seen. I think it's from the 1980s of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, going before Congress to speak on behalf of funding PBS. And it's kind of a feel-good video because he's speaking to a very angry congressman who clearly doesn't want to fund PBS. And by the end of Mr. Rogers' speech, the man is practically in tears saying, "You'll get your money," which, it's very touching. And I like watching the video, but it is a real political failure that's what one has to do as opposed to some sort of tax on an item that's separated from political discretion.
Yeah. All right. We're getting close to the end. So I had one last question through the QR codes, and it's very pragmatic. So I thought maybe it would be a good one. As executive director for a nonprofit news organization, I find it extremely difficult to identify donors or funding sources. What platforms or networks are currently available to assist nonprofits in seeking funding? Do you have any suggestions on a real nuts and bolts?
I mean, the Press Forward right now, right? The whole point of Press Forward is to make it much easier and have a one-stop shop. It's still getting up and running, but that's definitely if you're U.S. based. If you're not I assume most of the audience is probably U.S. based, but if you're not U.S. based, then the Global Forum for Media Development has a lot of resources on its website for nonprofit news organizations.
There are organizations like INN and Lion, which are all which are kind of collection groups and collaboratives. And so all of those spaces, I mean, it is, but I think the question itself speaks to some of the difficulty as we've seen an emerging nonprofit news sector, is that it is hard. It's still a sector that has too few funders, and we all deeply appreciate the funders who are in that space and doing that work. And we've seen a massive, as the numbers showed earlier, growth in that sector that has not been met yet with a growth in philanthropic money, much less public participation, right? And so I mean, I'm on the board of several nonprofit news organizations, and I'm the executive editor of another, and so I get it. And it's one of the reasons that I feel strongly that we can't talk about independence without economic independence, that you can't do independent journalism if you're worried about your journalism having to make you $1 so you can keep the lights on.
Also, American Journalism Project is another good institution that's focused on this. But going back to what we were just discussing, I think one of the limitations here and what's different from when the public broadcasting system was being established, which really was being incubated by the major foundations in this country. And I'm not seeing this as much with Press Forward today, as much as I'm very excited about what they're doing. But there was, at least back then, a recognition that the nonprofit philanthropic world alone could not support this new system that needed to emerge. And they always knew that government would get involved with public investments, democratically determined was the plan. And there was, you're right, there were meant to be an excise tax on TV sets. So it wasn't inevitable that we would end up with this very politically and economically weak public broadcasting system, which, as Wes said earlier, is really a misnomer for what we have. So I think we need to reimagine that entire model.
Yes, on that note, I agree. And I just want to ask everybody to join me in thanking all the panelists. And this is really interesting discussion. Thank you.